Hello everyone, before we start lesson 3, let's have a quick look at what we learned in lesson 1 and 2. So remember, lesson 1 was all about the question of what is wealth. And we learned labor is wealth, so it's the most important thing to protect, that and the land where you can actually do your labor. The next thing is the best place to store wealth, which is not controlled by anyone, is precious metals. So most people like precious metals because it's not controlled, it's hidden, and it's got a lot of labor behind it, so it is a good store of wealth. Lesson 2, that we looked at what inflation and deflation was. And the first thing I really wanted to drill in was please do not get fooled by nominal confusion. Just because prices are going up doesn't mean you're getting wealthier. It's actually the opposite. When prices go down, that's when the nation gets wealthier, because then you can buy more stuff. As long as your production is keeping going, you're getting richer. Just remember the little analogy I did about the island economy with the coconuts, the bananas, and the shells. So that's the main thing I wanted you to learn in lesson 2. So the thing you have to look at is value the price of things against labor, not a number. Price and value are two very different things. Price can be very misleading. So always look at how much labor it takes to get that object. Okay, so lesson 3, we're going to have a look at how money is created today, and this directly leads into what is the likely outcome of all this mess that's going on at the moment, and what is going to happen in possibly the next few years or so. Alright, so first thing is we're going to look at the two ways the money is created. We have fractional reserve lending and quantitative easing. We're going to look at fractional reserve lending first. Already got a picture. We won't look at it yet. We're going to have a look at a few dot points. Okay, so fractional reserve lending is basically when banks can lend more money than they actually have. The average number most countries do is about 10%. Although I think there's a few countries that even go down to 0. I'm pretty sure I read America went down to 0% at the start of 2020. So that means they're very desperate. So they only have 10% or so money in the actual bank accounts and what they lend out. Okay, of course, the actual system is more complicated than this, but this is introductory. Okay, so next is 90% of all loans is currency created from thin air, and it's all backed by debt. A system of currency right now is backed by debt. It was backed by gold, now it's backed by debt. Money has to be backed by something, otherwise it's worthless. It is pure fiat and it would have collapsed already. But because it's backed by debt, it's taking longer to collapse. Okay, so and the thing we're moving in towards, remember, is a currency backed by servitude or compliance, which means everyone is going to be a slave. Okay, so all of this currency is backed by debt, which is what I just said. 90% of it is debt. Only 10% of it is real money. So if you have a debt collapse, that's a lot of debt it can take out. Okay, and the last thing is commercial banks loan from the central banks. They don't actually print it out thin air. It comes from the central bank, and that's the only entity can print out of thin air. Alright, so let's have a look at our little pictures here. I've got to get out my laser pointer, and we've got this snazzy looking man here. And he's earned a few dollars. Let's say it's 100 each, he's got $300, and he wants to put it somewhere safe. So he went to a bank and he deposited his money. And to keep this analogy simple, we're going to say he's the only customer of the bank, and the bank only has $300. It's brand new, one customer, $300, that's it. Right now it's a liability to the bank because they have to pay interest to him, even though their interest rates would be like 0.02% interest. Not a big liability, but a liability. So the bank's not making money, it's not happy. Okay, but then comes along this woman here and she wants to buy a house. And she doesn't have enough money for this house because inflation has inflated the house price up to unaffordable levels, and she has to borrow a lot of money from the bank. The bank, however, doesn't have a lot of money. It only has $300. and the house is worth a lot more than 300. So what happens is, well, let's say, because we did 10% up here, it's only 3,000. Well, our numbers are low then, aren't it? Alright, so the bank gives a whole big pile of cash to the lady. So all this cash just popped out of nowhere, basically, and it went to the lady. Remember, the bank only had that amount, the $300. Now they have a big pile, and they can give to this lady here to buy a house. So most of that money is popped out of nowhere, but remember, it's debt. Where does this debt come from? Debt means you have to have a creditor, and the creditor is the Reserve Bank. Any reserve bank of the country. They're the only entity allowed to print money. So they print out the money, give it to the bank and say, here, have this money. It is worthless. It had no labor behind it, but we're going to charge you for it anyway. And let's say we're going to keep with low interest rates. They charge 1% of interest rate to the bank, which means the bank will probably charge 3% to the lady. So then they get a 2% difference. That's their little profit. So that's how the money is created. So we have someone here who thinks he's got money in the bank, but it's gone already to this lady's house. But the money had to be borrowed from this Reserve Bank. So in the end, everyone is a debtor to the Reserve Bank indirectly. This lady, she's a debtor to the Reserve Bank. The bank is a debtor to the Reserve Bank. And you can probably start seeing what happens if a debt collapse occurs. Everyone has to owe money to the Reserve Bank. What happens if you default on your loans? The creditor gets everything. So that means this lady, she can't pay her mortgage. The bank gets the house. If the bank can't pay their debts, well, the Reserve Bank gets the assets of the commercial bank. So that means the Reserve Bank can get everything. And what is a Reserve Bank? It's the arm of the government. So it's looking like they can quite easily grab all of everyone's assets, everyone's property, everyone's labor, because you can grab businesses too. So if you're in debt, you can lose everything to Reserve Bank, which is the government. It's a very sneaky way to grab the means of production. You put everyone into debt to the government, but no one realizes it because it's hidden by a commercial bank as a front. And then everyone loses everything to the Reserve Bank. We'll talk about that more later on. But that's fractional reserve lending. The bank gives more money than it actually can afford, and it does that by borrowing money from the Reserve Bank. Alright, so let's have a look at the quantitative easing. So, quantitative easing works by governments sell bonds to central banks. UK most prominently I have here, because UK has actually done something a little tricky. Well, not tricky, but they broke the actual rules of the game and they borrow straight from the central bank. You'll understand this a bit more in the next slide because you can't actually do that. It's a bit more convoluted than just going straight to the central bank because that's illegal. But the UK government started doing that in 2020. Most countries sell their bonds through asset swaps. We'll have a quick look at what asset swaps are next. And this artificial demand lowers interest rates and increases the debt burden further. So remember, all new money is debt. So if the government is having to continuously get more money from the Reserve Bank, that means they're getting to more debt. And they're having to keep printing and printing to keep interest rates low so they can afford debt. Until even 0% is too expensive because the debt burden just gets too high. You're having to print way too much money, create too much debt to keep the debt cheap until 0% is too expensive. That's why in Europe they have negative interest rates. 0% interest rate is too expensive for the governments to afford. Alright, so let's have a look at how the quantitative easing works. So we have our Reserve Bank and we have our government with the bond. So a bond is essentially a loan. Let's say that this is only $100. It's like I want to lend out $100 to people. And then you got someone say, hey, I'll buy that bond. You're going to pay me 5% interest rate a year on it? Great. I love that. $5 a year for free. Good. And you get the money back. And then if it's a 10-year bond, in 10 years' time, the government has to pay out the whole amount. 3-year bond, they have to pay out the whole amount. And that's how bonds work. Okay, so what the government wants to do, they want to sell their bonds. They usually sell it to the public. People like you and I buy bonds. Or other countries, and they buy the bonds. However, let's say there's not enough demand for all the bonds the government is printing. Not many people want to buy it. A lot of the public don't want to buy it because interest rates are low. You're losing money buying it because the inflation's higher. If you have high inflation interest rate, you're losing money. And a lot of countries don't want to buy the bonds anymore because they know they're going to start losing money on it. So there's not a lot of people wanting to buy this government's bonds. And it's happening all around the world. And they've got one buyer left. And that is the Reserve Bank. And they're the only ones left because, well, they don't care about money. They just print it. So they're like, yeah, we'll buy your bond. We can print it. It means nothing to us. So that's what they want to do now. They have to go to the buyer of the last resort. But the government just can't go to the Reserve Bank and say, hey, buy my bond. That's illegal. The government can't buy something from the government. So they need a middleman. And the middleman are the banks. Just like with fractional reserve lending, the banks were the middleman. And again, quantitative easing, the banks are the middleman again to get around the laws because the government can't borrow or lend from itself. So banks, they have a lot of bonds. A lot of bonds because by law, they have to borrow loans because bonds are seen as safe. So they have to get a lot of bonds from the government. So what happens is to incentivize the transference, the asset swap of all the bonds, what happens is the Reserve Bank says, hey, you've got a lot of bonds, Commonwealth, or whatever bank, I'm going to buy the bonds from you. So the Reserve Bank can buy bonds from Commonwealth, can't buy it from the government. So Commonwealth offers the bank a lot of money for the Commonwealth to sell bonds to the bank. And because they have just increased the demand artificially from fake money, the prices of the bonds go up, the interest rate goes down. So what happens next is the bank wants to buy more bonds. It keeps going up. So they start, we have the picture here. He gives the bonds to Reserve Bank. Now, next picture I want is a bank's like, hey, government, can I have more bonds? The Reserve Bank keeps buying them from me and I'm making money from it because they keep going up because it's increased the demand. And the government's like, sure, I'll sell you my bonds. No one else wants to buy them. Here you go, take the bonds. And the Commonwealth is just like, yes, we've got the bonds. Let's keep selling them to Reserve Bank for all this funny money that has no labor behind it, no wealth at all. And so now the Reserve Bank is buying bonds indirectly from the government using all of the commercial banks as middlemen and incentivized by the commercial banks because they're selling it to the Reserve Bank for more money than they bought it from the government. So it's one huge Ponzi scheme, reselling and selling all the way around just so they can keep the interest rates low, just so they can keep giving the government money so it doesn't go bankrupt. Okay, so that's how quantitative easing works. And I've got some writing at the top just to remember a few things. Main thing, remember, this is all debt. The Reserve Bank doesn't just give out things for nothing. It has to be backed by debt because our currency is backed by debt. And all the bonds are debt as well. So that's why it's an asset swap. Because this money's an asset to the Reserve Bank. He's swapping his assets of the cash, which has an interest rate, for the assets of the bonds, which have an interest rate as well. So it's an asset swap. It's technically not a purchase, how it goes like that. So it's all these tricky mechanisms to get away with everything. So we've got up here, remember, every single asset swapped in this scenario is a loan, which is what I just described. It's all debt-based. Because there is increased demand for the bonds increase in price. And that's why the commercial banks love reselling it, because they keep going up and up and they're making money for nothing. And the Reserve Bank has to print more to keep this charade going. each bond gets more expensive if they buy from Commonwealth or from any commercial bank. So it gets more and more and more expensive. And the debt burden just keeps getting higher and higher and higher because everyone keeps owing more and more debt because it's all debt backed by debt. And this increases the debt burden. Government's getting into more debt doing all this because all that is debt obligations. All the bonds, debt obligations. That is a loan, not actual money. It's a loan. To keep rates low, we have to continuously increase our debt. So to make sure we can pay back our debt, we have to increase our debt. Doesn't make sense. It's not going to end well. The only way you can stop this from not turning into a deflationary cycle is if you just take it off the debt backing. If suddenly we're like, hey, let's just stop this debt. No more. I can't see that happening. If the Reserve Bank goes, okay, no more interest rates, it's just gone. All that money we just splashed around, it's free now. And we're going to hand out more, and it's all free. Nothing backed by it. If you did that, you have hyperinflation very quickly. Okay, so we looked at fractional reserve lending and quantitative easing, what it was. So we know what it was. It's essentially the banks giving out more money than they have. Quantitative easing is governments borrowing money from the Reserve Bank because it's got no other buyers. Okay, so what are the effects of fractional reserve lending? The effect is we've been doing this for about 50 years. And what's happened in 50 years? Asset prices have ballooned, especially houses, because what do most people borrow money for? Houses. So asset bubbles in every market are dominated by debt. 95% or so of the housing market is debt. Same with stocks, same with bonds. And it's getting very close to being unaffordable, which means, well, if you can't pay your debt, you default. It goes down. Either that or we get off the debt backing and we start printing with no obligation to that money at all. Okay, so this turns into trickle-down inflation, where you get the ultra-rich and everyone else is just getting poorer and poorer because wages don't keep up with prices. No one's wages in the middle class are keeping up with the prices of houses, for example. That's where most money goes. It's not keeping up with the prices of any other kind of assets going crazy either, like the stocks and bonds. That's why if you invested in stocks and bonds, you made a lot of money because it's a bubble of debt creation. So the people closest to the money printer makes the most money. That's why you can make a lot of money in investing in houses, flipping them quickly, keeping up the inflation train, because then you can buy cheaper stuff that's not going up. For example, technology that goes down in price because it's made by China and they work for slave labor, and you're getting more efficient at building that stuff. You get more efficient and you can make more, it gets cheaper. Okay, so let's have a look at what the effects of quantitative easing is. You increase the debt burden. The burden's getting bigger. Just so you're trying to keep the interest rate low. That's why you hear the politicians always say, it's okay, we can afford it, we got 0% interest. Yeah, but what happens when 0% interest is not affordable? That's the problem. That's when you're basically done. Negative interest rates don't work. Look at Europe. Okay, so what happens then? Wide-scale debt collapse, and it's already starting in China. Or hyperinflation. We've already got high inflation from America. They're lucky they can actually outsource to inflation. But we don't actually know which option is going to happen left. Will it be debt collapse or hyperinflation? Or happens to what kind of choices will the people in power make over the next year or so? Okay, so that brings up to what's next? Will it be inflation or deflation? So let's have a quick look at the impacts of what would happen if it is inflation. So let's say the people in power do not want the debt bubble to collapse. They just keep printing, they take the backing of debt, and they also start giving the average people a lot of money, which they've started doing in 2020. They started giving more people money, which is why we're seeing high inflation. Only high inflation, not hyper. To get into hyper, you have to have a change in the psyche, and you have to have more printing to the average person than what we've currently seen. But what you get is assets continuing to increase. Houses, stocks, bonds, they don't go down. So people who are waiting for houses to crash, it's not going to happen if they choose to take the inflationary route. They just go up forever. It's just that the money is just worth less and it's harder to buy them. So this means people who have debt already, a mortgage, it becomes easier for you to pay off your mortgage, but it becomes harder for anyone to buy a house who already hasn't. So these people, if you haven't got a house now, you're kind of essentially locked out if this happens, if this scenario happens. Okay, commodities will eventually break out. They've been suppressed for so long. In inflation, they break out the best because they are physical. They are the hardest thing to put, not hardest, but they're physical, so you have to actually produce them. Same with houses, basically. So they actually go up in price quite well, and they'll go up quite quick to catch up with everything else. So if you want to make some money during inflation, you have to go where things are cheap. Commodities. They've got the most move. For example, houses, stocks, bonds are already up high, so they've got less to move. They'll continue to go up, but not as much. Interest rates will remain low. If they keep printing, interest rates remain low. Simple as that. So your debt will be still easy to pay off. Wages will fail to keep up with prices. It will get worse because inflation gets faster and faster. So you'll fall further and further and further behind with all the wages. So if you want to try and keep up with the price, put some money into somewhere that's going to go faster than inflation. And your only place is commodities. That's the only thing that will probably go up faster than inflation. Everything else goes up, but slower than inflation. Okay, so actions. We had a look at it a bit while looking at the impact. Lock in prices now, which basically means stock up food. If food's going to get more expensive, buy it now. Simple as that. And have it, of course, long life food, because that means you can eat it later on for the price when it was a year or two ago. The things that are going to keep up with inflation or beat it are gold, silver, commodities, and possibly crypto. The young people will be falling in love with crypto at this point. I told you, it works. It is a store of value. It's going to the moon. They're already saying that. Now, imagine if inflation gets worse. So they're your best bets for beating inflation. Next, savers will be the big losers in this scenario. If you've got all your money in the bank account or cash, you will lose in this scenario because that money will go down in value very quick. Whereas debtors can benefit because your mortgage is getting cheaper because your wages will go up, just not as quick as inflation. Okay, let's have a look at a deflationary scenario. Impact, mass loan defaults. Deflationary means less money in the system, so that means you have less money to pay your debt. So people default on loans. This means businesses, big businesses, small businesses start to default on loans. This means less jobs for people. So people have to now default on their mortgages because they don't have jobs. People have to default on stocks and bonds because they can't pay the debt on them. You get debt calls, you get margin calls, mostly in stocks. So if you have all your stocks on debt, you get the broker will be like, well, I'm not covering the loss. Sorry, you pay for that margin. And if they can't afford to pay for that margin, which a lot of people can't who are in the stock market because they always think it's just going to go up, they don't have to sell stuff to pay for the margin and then try and sell their stocks. They will try to escape because they don't want to pay the margin again. But to who is the question? Who's going to buy a stock that's going to continuously go down? Okay, next. Asset prices plunge. So we just had a look. Loan defaults means the prices will go down. If there's more sellers than buyers, prices go down. And this means even gold will go down. People will be selling gold to pay off their debt obligations. They sell everything to pay off debt obligations if they're desperate enough. So gold will go down too, but don't be scared about that. Gold rides out deflation better than most things. Because gold is a thing that's stable. You have mass employment and housing foreclosures. Same as what I said before because of the loan defaults. Less money go around, less jobs, less people able to afford their houses. Government will shrink because, well, they just can't afford it. It's just not that, the inner core of the government will be affected. It's the people on the edge. It's your average teacher, your policeman. They either get a pay cut or they lose their jobs. And you'll see there's less policemen, there's less teachers. You've got 40 kids per teacher and so forth. And those teachers aren't earning much money anymore. That's going to be the scenario in a deflationary. It's been seen many times. Just look at the 70s in America, the most recent time in a modernized country. Interest rates increase. This is because there's less money, so money's worth more. People want money. If there's less of something, it's worth more. So cash is king. So interest rates go up. So your interest rate in your savings account will go up. So savers will win for a while in deflation. That's if you can keep your money. So yeah, interest rates go up. That means it's harder to pay for debt more so because the debt's getting more expensive. Your amount of money to pay it off is decreasing, but the price of the debt's also getting more expensive, which makes it worse. And also, last thing, banks collapse. Remember, they're all 90% or so debt. They don't have a lot of real money. If there's a debt collapse, well, banks collapse with it. And that's what I was saying in the last one. The central bank can then take all the assets of the commercial banks. And that's why we do QE, to save the banks from collapsing right now. Okay, so actions in a deflation. Once again, stock up on food. Not because you're locking in prices, but because there'll likely be shortages. If businesses are going under from not being able to pay their debt obligations, they're not producing stuff. This includes businesses that provide food, farms and so forth. So there will be shortages. That's exactly what happened in 1929 in the Great Depression. It started with debt on tractors. That's why they lost a lot of food. The farms went down out of business. So there was less food. So stock up on food because there will be shortages. Get out of debt. If you're in debt and you're in a debt crash, you're going down with it. It is a trap. That your creditor will get your assets. And the creditor of everyone is the Reserve Bank. Okay, during the debt crash, cash is king. Cash is becoming rarer because most of the cash is debt and it's disappearing in debt defaults. So it is king. It's the only thing going up for a while. Maybe even bonds will go up for a little while because bonds essentially is cash. But that's more of a risky take. So cash, yeah, like I said here, cash will be the only thing going up. You all might think cash is trash right now, but if we get deflation, cash is king. Gold can also ride out deflation quite well after an initial downturn because people go into gold when they're afraid. So in inflation or deflation, gold does well. It does better in inflation than deflation, but it still does well in both. Okay, but unlike gold, avoid crypto. Crypto is a bubble. It will collapse in deflation, probably be the worst hit area in a deflationary crisis. So crypto is a risky play. Like I said, in inflation, crypto will probably do really well because it will just bolster all the people into crypto for their decision. But in deflation, people will be running scared. So avoid crypto if you think we're going to see deflation. Go into it if you think you're going to see inflation. You could do well. Okay, but the question is, what do the elites want? So do they want inflation or deflation? To try and understand what they want, we've got to try and think, what have they said they actually want? They've been quite open about it. They've written books about it. And they've made videos and everything. We kind of know what they want. Okay, first thing, they want to own everything. You know the whole saying, you own nothing and you'll be happy? That's because the elites will own everything. And the people will lose all of their property. The elites will own it all through the Reserve Bank. They also want a financial crisis. And this is because they want to introduce their new currency, their enslavement-backed currency, the central bank digital currency. So they want the central bank to survive, of course, if that's what the currency is going to be based on. But they can only introduce that if there's a crisis. You can't just go to people and say, hey, take this new thing when people are like, but what we've got is fine. You have to have a crisis where people are demanding for it. They're like, please help us, help us. And the government and the central bank, yeah, here's your CBDC, it will save you. So they need a financial crisis. It has to be financial because their solution is financial. Last thing they want, bigger government. They want government to own everything. And they want to have ownership of the government. So with those three things in mind, what would they prefer? Would they prefer inflation? Let's have a look what inflation is. It can help people to pay off their mortgages, since there is more money. So this doesn't exactly tailor to their first goal of owning everything. So let's put a cross here. Next, this crisis is more gradual. It takes quite a while, builds up. You even have a golden period of a year or two where people think everything's amazing during this crisis. And we're probably in that period now, actually. I reckon we are. But this crisis is gradual, and people tend to go along with it for many years. Just look at Venezuela. They've been going for 5 years now? 6 years? And they're all starving, and they're not doing much about it. They're just trying to keep up. You're too busy keeping up to do much else. So it doesn't really benefit them. They don't want it. They don't want things to take too long, and they don't want it to go for too many years. They most likely want it to be quick. It's a half-half, if they like it or not. So we can do a cross and a tick, half-half. The last thing is, though, blame is generally directed toward the government. People get switched on. They know where the money's coming from, and they blame the government. So they definitely don't want that. Okay, let's have a look at deflation. People default on their mortgages or sell their houses just to survive. They want to own everything. There you go. That's a big tick. Goes to the commercial bank. Commercial bank can go down, then the Reserve Bank takes it. Elites have your property. Next, this is a sudden and visceral crisis. This means people demand the government for help. It's far more impactful than inflation. It's not gradual. It happens very quickly, and people want help from this very rapidly. Just look at the Great Depression in America, greatest example. As soon as it happened, they demanded the government to help, and FDR made things worse trying to help. So, another big tick. Blame is directed towards capitalism. They go on with the whole narrative. This is the end of capitalism. The whole communist thing, what do they call it? The end of, I don't know, there's an actual term for it. It's not the end of capitalism, no, it's the start of communism. Socialism is the start of communism, and we've been in socialism for almost 100 years. Okay, so this is a tick. The blame is not on the government, it's on capitalism. Banks will collapse, and everyone thinks commercial banks are separate from the government. So this is a good thing for the elites, because it's capitalism getting the blame. The bank's getting the blame, not the government. But who gets all of the assets of the banks? The central bank, the government. They get to own everything and get none of the blame. So we've got 4 ticks for deflation. So most likely, we're going to have a deflationary event soon, not an inflationary. So that's probably confused a few people, because people were expecting inflation, but we're most likely going to get deflation, a very severe deflationary event. Alright, so right near the end, we're going to have a quick look at my scenario and areas that I think would be good to put your money if you want to try and gamble on what's going to happen. Okay, so remember, this is all the thoughts of just me, who is a nobody. It's just all speculation. Alright, so let's have a quick look at what my scenario is. Like I said, they want deflation, we're going to get a market crash. And I just included cyber attack just because, they war gamed the cyber attack recently. So, they war gamed COVID, we got COVID. They're war gaming a cyber attack, we're probably going to get a cyber attack. So just keep that in mind, and they're probably going to do that just to be a catalyst. Because if you have markets go down for a couple of days, a lot of fear gets in. No one trusts the markets anymore, and they start selling. So it could be their black swan. I say that in quotations, their black swan event. Alright, so let's have a look how normally downturns occur when you get to deflation from where we are now. So this picture here means prices are going up. If things are getting more expensive, the average person has less money. They're spending more money on their debt obligations, on their energy, on their petrol, and on their food. So that means less money on going out to places, restaurants, movie theaters, or the kids' activities. Less money for that kind of things. So this means businesses start to struggle and they go down, they're getting less money. Then we got people getting unemployed, businesses going under. And this sets off just a very generic bear market where people start selling their houses and their stocks. So it's a pretty simple thing when you've got a slowdown of the economy and people start to sell. And this is kind of happening in America and China right now. Not so much Australia, but we don't need it to happen in Australia. If it happens in China, well, it affects Australia. We're very directly. We are so tied in with China's economy that we essentially are China's economy right now. Okay, so if you have the market crash, what happens is, as I said before, you get the mass defaults and unemployment and selling of assets. Things go down. The transfer of wealth from the people to the banks. So if people are defaulting, remember, money isn't wealth. What is wealth is the physical objects. If people can't afford the houses, who takes the house? The banks take the house. And I don't think they're going to do foreclosure sales either. If they do, they'll probably sell it to, well, no one, because there's no one really buying anything. It would just probably be rich people in their pocket or the central bank. Because you already got banks in America already buying houses because they want to be the new lenders, the new landlords of the next world, the only landlords of the next world. Okay, so this is a transfer of wealth because it's people selling all the stuff back to the bank, basically. Okay, so we've got two options now. Banks collapse because they can't pay off all their debts. They own their debts to the central bank, so the central bank takes all the assets. The central bank and the government essentially owns everything. This is when CBDCs is introduced. They have everything, they have what they want, and people are poor, they don't have a lot of money. So then the central bank can be like, hey, you guys want money? We've got money, but it's a new type of money. You can take it now. Okay, the main problem with this scenario is the currency strengthening. So you have people who, well, they don't want to give up their money for CBDC. They're like, well, I'm making interest on my money for the first time ever. Why would I give it up? It's the only thing I want to keep at the moment. I'm losing everything else. So that's the big problem. But it's still possible because a lot of people will be like, yeah, well, this sucks. Maybe the CBDC will be better. Okay, other option. So this option is straight down. Just all down. No inflation. Until they bring out the CBDC and you've got a whole new scenario. It is the Great Reset. There's just, square one. That's it. Okay, but scenario 2. You go straight down and then you go into inflation. This is possible. So printing continues for the banks or after banks collapse. Doesn't matter. Depends whether they want to save the commercial banks or not. If they have a use for commercial banks or not during this period. But printing commences again. They can say like, okay, we're running out of money. Oh no, this is not good. We have to keep printing. And this is when they bring in UBI. So the main thing to look out for, if you want to think it's switching from deflation to inflation, if you ever see any kind of UBI, we're going to go towards inflation. Because once you start to give the people free money, you've got inflation. This is when hyperinflation ensues. It takes a little while because you have to have the psyche shift, but it will happen once you introduce UBI. Okay, now, because you have hyperinflation, the money is losing its value. No one trusts the money anymore. So remember, in the first scenario, people still trust the money. So you have to really work hard to get some people away from the cash and into CBDC. In this scenario, basically everyone wants to get out of money. They're desperately looking for something that wants to get out of money. So you introduce the CBDC during the hyperinflation because everyone wants out of the money. But the problem with that scenario is the government sentiment could be at all-time lows because people know it's the government printing the money. They know they're the ones causing the problem. So you can see it can be quite hard for the CBDC to be introduced, either because people still have too much faith in the money or because people have too little faith in the government. But they're the only two routes I could see happening where they're going to go down. And it's really hard to predict which route they'll take. But if you want to have a good road sign that's letting you know what the route is going to be next, it's this, UBI. So if you ever see money going straight to the people, they're switching from a debt collapse to hyperinflation or some high inflationary event. So just keep an eye out for UBI. But most likely, as I said before, we will have deflation first. Okay, but if we look at the one on the left where it's just straight down, it's just a collapse and then a reset. This can take within a year. It could be very rapid. A debt crisis is very quick. And especially if we're this big in debt, if we're this high up, the fall is rapid. And within a year or so, you could see the CBDC being introduced and we've got the whole reset. It's a whole new economy. And it's all based on slavery. You're either in it or you're locked out. On the other hand, if you do the debt and then you try and do the hyperinflation to get people to lose faith in the currency, this can take 2 to 3 years. We've already got inflation now, so that's in the system. And then you get the debt out of the way. Inflation can just move so much easier without the debt. So that will be far quicker. As you see right now, inflation's hard to get moving. And that's just because the debt's holding it down. But without the debt, it can move far quicker. But this can take 2 to 3 years. So it's a bit slow, but still within the time frame you hear about. They always go on about how the reset won't happen to 2025 and that the pandemic's going to continue into 2024, 2025. So within 2-3 years, it's still possible that they're going to take this option. But keep in mind, what option are you going to do? Straight down or down, then up? Okay, so let's have a quick look at investing. Golden rule for investing: buy cheap, sell expensive. So what's cheap? And please keep in mind, I know nothing. Literally, I have never been successful with this. This is just random crap I have been listening to for ages. Okay, first thing, precious metals. It's cheap. Simple as that. If you want to get into precious metals, go into ETF managed funds. They're the easier thing to look at. Look at that in your own time, what an ETF or managed fund is. I personally prefer managed funds. Or you can look into royalties, mining, or explorers. The safest is royalty, then miners, then explorers is the most risky. Same thing, uranium. Uranium is cheap because it's hated because it blew up 10 years ago in Japan. So, and it's already making a comeback. People are building uranium, not refineries, uranium power plants right now. So that means demand's going to increase. So possibly go into uranium. It could be just as good as precious metals. Look into ETFs, managed funds. There's much fewer options than precious metals, but they're out there. Refineries, there's a really good refinery in Australia. Mining, the mining companies as well. Explorers, same thing, most risky. Okay, a bit out of left field, sugar. Sugar actually has performed better than precious metals in the past during crisis. That's just how much everyone loves sugar. So your options to invest in sugar are less. You can probably find some ETF or managed funds, but if you're looking at the managed funds and ETFs, you're most likely going to go into some kind of commodities managed fund or ETF, where sugar is lumped in with stuff like soybeans and wheat. Or you can try and find the companies that grow, refine, and sell sugar and try and invest directly into them. But if you always invest into one company, you really have to do your due diligence, really look into it. That's why ETFs managed funds are safer, because it spreads out from not just one company, but a few. Okay, last thing is your crops. Crops are cheap right now, very cheap. So cheap farmers are having a lot of trouble of making any money. So invest in crops, buy cheap. What does everyone always need, even during a financial crisis? They need food. So once again, just look into some ETFs managed funds for crops. It will be down under as commodities. Commodities are normally broken up to their crops or the mining sector. Next, this is the black horse, coal. Everyone's probably thinking, Andrew, you're crazy. Everyone hates coal. Exactly. If it's hated, it's cheap. Buy cheap, sell expensive. Will coal be the next tobacco? Everyone hates tobacco, especially in the West. But tobacco has actually been the most successful investing sector in the last 50 years. That's because even though America, Australia, England and so forth went through their whole phase of hating tobacco and we all stopped smoking, the rest of the world, they didn't. Asia picked it up at this time. The tobacco companies said, well, who cares about the West? Let's go sell to Asia where there's a lot more people. And they made a lot of money. And Europe still smokes a lot as well. So they were very successful, even though very few people knew about it. So will coal be the next tobacco? And there's a really good indication of this. A lot of countries are still building coal power plants. This includes India and China, who have the biggest populations. So they're going to need to buy a lot of coal. So coal could be a good dark horse investment. Last one, the green movement. Do not buy the companies that say they're going to sell the stuff for the green movement. For example, Tesla's a bubble. And do not buy anything that says they're going to sell like solar panels. They're going to build the solar panel farms and so forth. Everyone's already buying into them. Don't do that. What you want to buy is the materials they're going to use. Look at what materials they need for electric cars, for wind turbines, and for solar panels. That's because if all the governments do all their green ideas, there's not enough materials in the world for it right now. You're going to have to build a lot of mines, and it takes a very long time to build mines. So this means there will be a shortage of these metals. And when there's a shortage, the prices go up. So because of this increased demand, prices will go up in copper, silicon, silver, zinc, lithium, nickel, and cobalt. The two I'll be worried about are copper and silicon. That's just because copper is heavily reliant on the infrastructure sector. And if we go through a depressionary cycle, our infrastructure sectors all around the world are in massive bubbles. If they collapse, for example, China, which is the biggest infrastructure bubble, that means a lot of demand for copper is lost. Same with silicon. If a lot of these people are poor and they're buying less laptops and TVs, the demand for silicon drops as well. A bit more of the other stuff, but mostly silicon and copper I think will be hit the most with the depressionary hit. So be wary about that. And they will go crazy if the green movement goes ahead and they encounter shortages. Right, so that's the end of everything. I know this was a long video, but thank you for staying to the end.